Welcome to The Explainer. I'm so excited to get into this one. Today, we're taking a completely fascinating dive into exactly how early postage stamps were made and used. We kind of take these tiny bits of paper for granted, but the 19th century industrial mechanics and honestly the wildly unexpected societal oddities behind them totally revolutionized global communication. Okay, let's dive right into this. Imagine grabbing a sheet of early stamps and finding a literal warning printed on the margin. When stamps first adopted adhesive, something Charles Dickens actually joked about as the Great British Gum Secret, people honestly didn't know what to do with it. The public literally had to be warned not to lick the adhesive or the cement completely off the back of the paper. So to really understand this whole factory to mailbox journey, here is our agenda. 1. Before the adhesive stamp. 2. Forging the master die. 3. Printing, gumming, and perforating. 4. Franking and cancellation. And 5. Beyond basic postage. Let's kick things off. Section 1. Before the adhesive stamp. From Paris wrappers to the penny black. So what did the chaotic world of mail actually look like before these sticky little squares solved the age-old receiver paste problem? Well, we have to bridge a pretty massive historical gap here. Way back in the 1600s, mail was incredibly inefficient, mostly because the person receiving the letter had to foot the bill. But in 1653, a Parisian named Monsieur de Villiers introduced special wrappers sold for just 1 sou. This localized system proved the whole prepayment concept worked, and that ultimately paved the way for Sir Rowland Hill. In 1837, Hill published a huge pamphlet advocating for a uniform, prepaid 1-penny postage. And that right there culminated in 1840, when the world's very first adhesive stamps were officially put to use. The core idea here is captured perfectly by the Billet de Port-Payé. This early French prototype perfectly illustrates what a stamp actually is. It wasn't just, decorative paper. It was a visual receipt. It proved to postal officials that you had already purchased the right to use their network. All right, moving into Section 2, Forging the Master Die, Industrial-Scale Mass Production. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly how they pulled this off. Once Rowland Hill's prepaid system was adopted, government suddenly needed millions of these receipts. To meet that massive demand, we've got to step onto the noisy, heavy, highly mechanized printing floors of the 19th century to see the famous Perkins-Bacon engraving method. Step 1. An artist engraved the design by hand onto a soft steel block. Step 2. They hardened that block to create the mother die. Think of it like a master key. Step 3. They transferred that impression onto a steel roller. And finally, Step 4. They rolled exact replicas onto a final printing plate. This process spawned millions of identical stamps, making forgery incredibly difficult. Now, to be fair, not everyone used that intense, deep steel engraving method. Depending on the tech they had on hand, different colonies adapted. Some used surface printing, where raised lines on a plate directly struck the paper with ink. Others, like early Western Australia, went with lithography, using chemical transfers to reproduce designs right onto stone. Different techniques for sure, but the exact same goal: high volume, secure replication. Moving right along, Section 3, Printing, Gumming, and Perforating, Finishing the Product. So moving out of the heavy printing rooms and into the finishing rooms, this is where ink and paper finally became sticky, usable postage. Remember that British gum secret we talked about earlier? The magic ingredient was actually dextrine, which is a starch preparation normally used by calico fabric printers. Out on the factory floor, dexterous workers, often young women, would rapidly paint this mucilage onto the backs of stamp sheets with these massive brushes. They were astonishingly fast, finishing between 30 and 40 full sheets every single minute. Now, check out this number: 300. Before perforation was a thing, people literally just cut stamps apart with scissors. It was a total mess. But the invention of the piercing apparatus changed the game. Workers placed the gummed sheets under a machine that struck the paper, separating the rows with exactly 300 fine denticulations, or teeth, per strike. It was an absolute mechanical marvel. But here is what you absolutely must take away from this. Because stamps were essentially currency, the factories required extreme security measures. They used exclusive watermarked paper, the printing presses were fitted with automatic sheet counting indicators, workmen were literally locked inside the factory during their shifts, no joke, and the presses themselves were secured at night with Chubb's patent detector locks to prevent rampant forgery and theft. So that brings us to a really pivotal question. Once millions of these secure stamps were printed, gummed, and sent out, how did the public actually use them out in the wild? Section 4. Franking and cancellation. Preventing reuse. Once out in the real world, authorities immediately ran into a massive headache. They had implemented franking, which just means proving you paid by sticking a stamp on the letter. But people immediately started peeling off and reusing the stamps. The solution? Obliteration. The post office had to ruthlessly defend its revenue, so they aggressively stamped over the Queen's head with heavy, ink-soaked cancellations. They used really distinct patterns, like heavy gridirons or this famous design known as the butterfly, to permanently kill the stamp's value so it couldn't be reused. You know what's incredibly fascinating, though? The simple concept of an adhesive stamp was so useful that postal systems even adapted it for their own internal administration. In cities like Augsburg, officials created specific returned letter stamps. These were internal adhesive labels used purely by clerks to manage the absolute administrative chaos of tracking and returning dead or unfranked letters to the senders. All right, our final stop, Section 5, Beyond Basic Postage, Weird and Unexpected Uses. Because human ingenuity is what it is, citizens quickly found completely bizarre and creative ways to use these little paper squares. Stamps temporarily became a secondary currency and an emergency communication tool. People used them for small remittances and currency exchange by post. In Edinburgh, subscribers literally paid their monthly telephone trunk line bills by mailing stamps right to the phone company. In mining districts, high-value stamps were used to frank heavy parcels of raw gold dust. And during the Siege of Mafeking, stamps were printed locally to frank letters carried by brave cyclist siege runners trying to bypass military blockades. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is my absolute favorite unexpected use, which comes from an 1871 Parisian charity masked ball. They used stamps as literal dance tickets. Gentlemen had to buy stamps and place them on their gloves. The rule was unstamped ladies were not to be invited to dance, and women could actually refuse to dance with anyone lacking a 20 or 50-cent time stamp. It was this ingenious, forced charity subscription that raised thousands, simply by using stamps as a social passport. So how did this 19th century little bit of sticking plaster pave the way for modern global communication? Think about it. It's incredible that an industrial printing experiment, one designed to solve a pretty boring billing issue, ultimately democratized information. It made it cheap and reliable for everyday people to connect across the globe. So next time you see a stamp, remember the massive factory floors, the locked doors, and the intricate steel plates that made it all possible. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer today.